I grew up on a farm in rural Kentucky, the kind of place where life is simple, nights are quiet, and traditions are passed down without much explanation. My family had one rule that never changed: never go past the tree line after dark. I heard it my whole life. My grandfather spoke of it like it was an unshakable truth. My mother repeated it without ever giving a real reason, and my father just shook his head, as if there was no need to question it. But I was never good at following rules blindly. At 17, with that reckless confidence that comes with being young, I decided I didn't believe in superstitions. And so, on one October night, I made the dumbest decision of my life. The plan was simple: wait until everyone was asleep, grab my flashlight, and take a few steps into the woods. Just enough to prove there was nothing there but trees and darkness. Maybe even snap a picture of the nothing to rub it in my little brother's face, since he always got nervous just looking at the tree line. So when the kitchen clock hit 1:17 a.m., I slipped out the back door, feeling the cold night air and the damp scent of earth. The field around the house was bathed in moonlight, and I could see the tree line clearly, a dark, unmoving wall in the distance. My feet sank slightly into the dewy grass as I approached. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from excitement. I stepped past the tree line without hesitation, feeling the air shift around me. It was like stepping into another world. The scent of the woods was heavier, almost suffocating, a mix of wet wood, decaying leaves, and something else I couldn't place. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted trunks and brittle branches that looked like reaching hands. I moved slowly, listening for anything beyond the sound of my own footsteps. But the silence was strange. No crickets, no rustling animals, just an absolute crushing stillness that seemed to press against my ears. I should have felt something. But the only thing I heard was my own breathing, growing louder with every second. Then, something moved. A faint sound, like leaves shifting underfoot. But there was no wind. I turned quickly, aiming my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing but trees. I swallowed hard and let out a short laugh, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I turned back to head home, my stomach dropped. The clearing where I had entered was gone. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, thick, suffocating. The farm, my house, my family, all of it had vanished behind a wall of trees that hadn't been there before. My first instinct was that I must have gotten turned around. I hadn't gone that far, right? I just needed to retrace my steps. But as I turned in circles, trying to find something familiar, I realized everything around me looked exactly the same. Twisted trees, exposed roots, dried-out branches. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew worse. I aimed my flashlight at the ground, searching for my footprints in the soft dirt. But there was nothing, just scattered leaves, as if no one had walked there in a long, long time. That's when I noticed something else. I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore. The sound of my movement felt muted, swallowed by the air itself. The flashlight flickered once, twice. The beam of light wavered as I clicked the button, trying to keep it on. And then, at the edge of its reach, I saw something between the trees. Figures, human-shaped silhouettes, standing motionless. My lungs locked up, and my body went rigid. I wanted to believe it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but as the flashlight flickered again, I could tell. They were real. Tall, thin, standing in the darkness, completely still, as if watching me. I couldn't make out faces or details, just warped shapes, like they were part of the forest itself. My throat was dry, and panic finally shoved my arrogance aside. My only thought was getting out. I spun on my heels and started moving fast, but the woods stretched further and further with each step. Every direction I turned, it felt like I was getting farther from where I needed to be. My chest rose and fell in rapid, panicked breaths, sweat running down my back despite the biting cold. And then, a snap. Right behind me, the sound of a branch breaking under something heavy. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. But the flashlight flickered again, and for just a second, I saw something too close. A face. Or at least, something that vaguely resembled one. Pale, featureless. No visible eyes, no mouth, no expression at all. Just a smooth surface, angled toward me as if studying me. My body reacted before my brain did. I ran. I ran without thinking, without looking back, without caring where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Branches clawed at me. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and behind me, footsteps. Many of them, getting closer. My vision blurred from pure panic, and my legs moved faster than they ever had before. I had no idea where I was running. I just knew I had to get out. The flashlight was completely dead in my hand now, and the only thing guiding me was the faint moonlight barely breaking through the canopy above. The ground beneath me felt different, uneven, as if I were being pulled deeper into a place where nothing was solid, where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. And the footsteps behind me weren't slowing down. If anything, they were getting closer. Then my foot caught on an exposed root and I crashed forward. My shoulder hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. But before I could even process the pain, I heard something right next to me. Breathing. Deep and uneven, like it was trying to mimic human breathing but didn't quite know how. My muscles locked up, but before I could move, a sound exploded through the forest. A sharp, deafening crack, like a tree splitting in half. And just like that, everything went silent. I lifted my head, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The figures? Gone. The footsteps? Gone. Just the forest, still and endless. And then I noticed something else. The clearing was there, out of nowhere. Exactly where it should have been all along. I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward it, not looking back, not thinking. The moment I crossed the tree line, my legs nearly collapsed from sheer relief. The open field had never felt so safe. I sprinted straight to the house, locked every door behind me, and didn't sleep a second that night. My parents never woke up. To them, nothing had happened. But I knew I would never question that rule again. I never told anyone what happened that night. Never mentioned how the woods swallowed the path back. Never spoke about the faceless figures, the distorted breathing, or the crushing silence that had filled the air. But since that night, when the sun goes down, I lock every door and keep my distance from the tree line. I grew up, moved away, built my own life. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up with that familiar feeling that something is standing in the dark, watching, waiting. I always thought that living in an isolated place would bring peace. My husband, Mark, and I had spent years surrounded by the noise and chaos of the city. So when we found that old farmhouse miles away from the nearest town, it felt perfect. I worked remotely, and Mark traveled a lot for work, so it wasn't unusual for me to spend a few nights alone. The house was spacious, with an abandoned barn in the back and a vast open field behind it. At first I loved the silence. But that night, the silence felt wrong. I had locked every door before going upstairs. It was cold, and the wind rattled the windows, but suddenly I started hearing something else. Something closer. A soft creak, like someone had stepped on the old wooden floorboards in the kitchen. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to laugh. The house was old. Wood expands and contracts with the temperature. The wind might have pushed a poorly latched door open. Still, when I went to the bathroom, I noticed something strange. The kitchen door, which I was sure I had closed, was slightly ajar. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the unsettling feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every shadow in the hallway felt darker than it should. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the rooms. Nothing. Everything was in place, the windows locked. I went back upstairs, locked my bedroom door and got into bed, trying to ignore the creeping unease. The wind kept howling outside, and after a while, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep, but my sleep was restless. I woke up a few hours later with a strange, icy feeling creeping up my spine. The room was dark, but something felt off. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw marks on the floor. Footprints, muddy footprints leading from the bedroom door to the side of my bed. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I knew those marks weren't there before, and I knew they weren't mine. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call Mark, but then I realized how badly my hands were shaking. I was in shock. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The bedroom door was still closed, locked, and yet the footprints were there, fresh, damp. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get out. I unlocked the door carefully and crept toward the living room, trying not to make a sound. My plan was simple: grab the car keys and drive to the nearest motel. But when I reached the kitchen, something made me stop. The back door lock was unlatched. I was sure I had locked it before going upstairs. My fingers hovered over the latch, and a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed it was cold, like someone had just touched it. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They said they'd send a unit, but I had to stay inside. I didn't want to stay a second longer in that house, but the fear of stepping outside and running into someone lurking in the dark was even worse. So I locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold floor, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally knocked on the door, I rushed to let them in, feeling a brief wave of relief. They searched the entire house. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints outside. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying maybe I had left the door open without realizing it, or that the footprints could have been mine, spread unintentionally. I wanted to believe that, but I knew. I knew those marks were fresh, that their shape was different from mine. Still, I accepted what they said. Maybe, deep down, I wanted them to be right. After they left, I gathered my courage and cleaned up the footprints, trying to push it all out of my mind. The next night came faster than I wanted. The house felt quieter, but it was a dense, heavy silence. I avoided looking into dark corners and kept the bedside lamp on. When sleep finally took over, I almost convinced myself that everything had been a misunderstanding. But in the morning, when I woke up, I noticed something was terribly wrong. My phone, which I had left charging on the nightstand, was unlocked. The photo gallery was open. And there, among the pictures from the previous day, was something that sent a freezing chill through my spine. Photos of me, sleeping. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't move a muscle as I scrolled through the images, seeing a sequence of photos that should not exist. The first one showed my face relaxed, turned slightly to the side on the pillow. The second one captured my breathing, visible in the slight movement of the blanket. But the third made my stomach turn. It was taken closer, as if whoever had taken it was leaning over me, close enough to hear me breathe. What made me want to throw up was the angle. It looked like the person had been standing right next to my bed, looking down at me. I dropped my phone and jumped out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I couldn't understand. I had locked everything. I hadn't heard a single sound. How had someone gotten in, stood next to me, taken pictures, and left without a trace? My legs felt weak as I rushed to the bedroom door, still locked, just as I had left it. My hands were clammy as I replayed every detail of the previous night in my head. Nothing made sense. This time I didn't hesitate. I called the police again, not caring if I sounded paranoid. When they arrived, things took an even more terrifying turn. They checked every lock, every window. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been forced open. Then one of the officers asked me something that sent ice through my veins. "Are you sure no one was already inside the house before you went to sleep?" The weight of those words crushed me. If no one had broken in overnight, that meant the person had already been there when I went to bed. I never spent another night alone in that house after that. Mark returned 2 days later, and even though we never fully understood what happened, he agreed it was best for us to move. A few months later, we found a new home in the city, and I swore I would never live in an isolated place again. To this day, I don't know who was with me that night. I don't know how they got in or how they left without a trace. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel that same eerie sensation of being watched. Like someone somewhere is still watching me. My grandfather was a man of habit. He woke up before sunrise, drank his black coffee, and spent hours sitting in his old rocking chair on the porch. When I was a kid, I'd sit by his feet and listen to his stories. Hard times, the land that had kept our family going for generations. When he passed away a little over a year ago, I inherited the property. Coming back after so long felt strange. Everything looked the same, yet different. The smell of old wood, the creaking floorboards. But what unsettled me the most was the chair. No one ever touched it. It just sat there, on the porch, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. Life on the farm was lonely, but I liked it. My days started early, feeding the animals, checking the fences, keeping up with the heavy routine of a farmer. That night, I was finishing up in the barn when a cold breeze cut through the air. The sky was clear, stars shining, but something felt off. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. I glanced toward the house, and my heart nearly stopped. The rocking chair was moving, slowly, back and forth. The creak of the wood echoed in the empty yard. I froze for a moment, trying to rationalize. "It's just the wind," I told myself. There was no one else here but me. I locked up the barn, forced out a nervous chuckle, and went inside without looking at the porch again. But that feeling, that heavy, prickling sensation of being watched, stuck to me like a shadow. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound outside, a slow, rhythmic creaking, the same sound from before. My chest tightened, but I refused to get up. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulled the blanket over my head like a child, and waited for silence. Morning came, and I dragged myself downstairs, still groggy. I poured a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch, trying to shake off the paranoia from the night before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and that's when I saw it. Footprints, imprinted in the dust. They led straight to the chair, but there were no footprints leading away from it. I froze. I crouched down, inspecting the marks on the floor. They were clear, distinct, boot prints, the kind my grandfather used to wear. But it didn't make sense. I hadn't stepped there since moving back, and no one else lived with me. My chest tightened as I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone had snuck onto the property during the night? An intruder? But why the hell would someone come all the way out here just to stop in front of the chair and then vanish? The rest of the day dragged on. I worked the fields, but my mind kept drifting back to those footprints. When night fell, I forced myself to ignore the unease. I locked every door and window before heading upstairs, but I hesitated before turning off the lights. On impulse, I stepped onto the porch and stared at the chair. It sat there, still as ever, I let out a breath, feeling ridiculous. "It's just exhaustion," I muttered. But as I turned to go inside, a soft creak cut through the air. My head snapped back. The chair was rocking. A chill ran down my spine. There was no wind that night. The air was heavy, completely still. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then it happened. A faint sound, almost a whisper, broke the silence. A dry, clicking noise, like a tongue against teeth. And right after that, the smell. A smell I knew too well. Tobacco. The same scent that clung to my grandfather's shirts, to the cushion of his chair. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't possible. I held my breath and took a step back. The chair slowed, as if whatever was in it had noticed me. And then, like someone had just stood up from it, it stopped completely. Silence filled the porch. My entire body tingled with fear. I wanted to convince myself that it was all in my head, but every cell in my body knew I was not alone. I backed away, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in the night. I shut the front door with a loud bang and locked it, as if a simple lock could keep out whatever was out there. But I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I stood frozen in the living room, listening. The silence was thick, pressing down on me. Minutes stretched on, long and unbearable, until I finally convinced myself it was over. But deep down, I knew. That presence still lingered. The next morning, daylight brought a false sense of safety. I took a deep breath before stepping outside, half hoping that I'd imagined it all. But as soon as I opened the front door, my blood ran cold. The footprints were back. But this time, they didn't just lead to the chair. Now, they led to the door, to where I had stood the night before. Watching me? A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned to the chair. It looked exactly the same, but the air around it felt dense, heavy. That was enough for me. I stepped back inside, grabbed an old sheet, and without thinking twice, threw it over the chair. I didn't want to see it anymore. I didn't want to feel its presence. Deep down, I knew it was a meaningless gesture. But somehow, it made me feel like I had taken control of the situation. And for some reason I still can't explain. After that night, the strange occurrences stopped. No more footprints, no more creaking, no more scent of tobacco in the air. I never got rid of the chair. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because something inside me told me it was better to leave it alone. It's still there, on the porch, covered by the same sheet. And I've never touched it again. Never seen it rock again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I still hear that faint creaking, like something or someone is still sitting there. I moved to this small town late last year. After a decade drowning in the chaos of the big city, I decided I needed some peace. A place where I could wake up without honking cars or sirens, and sleep without the glow of streetlights bleeding through my curtains. I found a simple, cheap house in a quiet area, surrounded by cornfields and neighbors who nodded in greeting but didn't pry. The only one I really connected with was Mr. Howard, an old man pushing 80 who lived next door. He was the kind of guy who always had a story to tell, and for some reason, he enjoyed my company. We talked almost every day over the backyard fence while he chewed on a piece of tobacco, spitting occasionally into the dirt. From the beginning, there was something strange about his property. More specifically, about the old shed in the back. It was a dark, weathered wooden structure, its double doors secured with a massive padlock. It didn't take me long to ask about it, and Howard's response was blunt. "Stay away from that shed, son. That's all I ask." It wasn't a threat, but a plea, like it was an unbreakable rule. I didn't push him for answers. But every time I passed by, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, like the shed itself was watching me. Still, the curiosity never left me. For months, I wondered what the hell was inside. Old tools? A broken-down tractor? Just a bunch of rusty junk he kept for sentimental reasons? I never saw anyone go in or out, and Howard avoided that part of the yard like it was cursed. Then, one night in February, the opportunity came. Howard suffered a heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. I heard about it from the neighbors, and while everyone worried about his health, my mind went straight to one thing. The shed was alone. For the first time, no one was there to stop me from taking a look. I waited until midnight, when the town was silent. Grabbing a flashlight, I hopped the fence, my heart pounding. To my surprise, the padlock wasn't latched. With a dry click, I pushed open the doors, sending a cloud of dust swirling in the air. The weak beam of my flashlight flickered across the wooden walls, revealing an almost empty interior. No old chests, no sinister tools. Just a table covered in dust and a rocking chair sitting in the center of the shed. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. I had built this up in my head for months, and in the end, it was just an empty room? What a joke. I turned to leave, laughing at myself. Then I heard it. It was a quiet sound at first, almost too soft to notice. A faint creak, like wood bending under a weight that wasn't supposed to be there. My whole body froze. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I slowly turned back, an icy chill creeping up my spine. The beam of light swept across the table, the walls, the dusty floor, and then stopped on the chair. It was no longer empty. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. The thing sitting there wasn't Howard. It wasn't anyone I knew. The flashlight revealed a thin, hunched figure, dressed in what looked like an old suit, tattered and covered in grime. The face, my God, the face was the worst part. The skin looked like melted wax, as if someone had tried to mold it, and then left it to dry, featureless. No eyes. Just a smooth, empty space where they should have been. And yet, somehow, I knew it was looking at me. The chair started rocking on its own, groaning softly in the crushing silence of the shed. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then without warning, it stood up. The sound that followed still haunts me. It wasn't a scream, nor a moan. It was as if dozens of voices whispered at once, in a pitch that made my brain feel like it was short-circuiting. My legs reacted before my mind did, and I bolted for the exit, stumbling in my panic. I ran across Howard's yard like a man fleeing the gallows. I vaulted over my fence without thinking, crashing onto my knees on the other side. My chest heaved, my lungs burned. When I finally worked up the courage to look back, the shed doors were closed. Nothing moved. No sound. Just Howard's darkened, empty house in the distance. Had I imagined all of it? Had my brain, fed by months of curiosity and paranoia, played some kind of cruel trick on me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I locked myself inside my house, turned on every light, trying to convince myself none of it was real. But how could I explain the sound? The empty chair? That thing standing up? My body was still trembling when the sun finally crept over the horizon. I decided I would never step foot in that yard again. Howard would be back in a few days, and I didn't want to be around when he found out what I had done. But then, something even worse happened. The next morning, I heard a noise from my porch. When I opened the door, my blood turned to ice. The rocking chair was there, the exact same one from the shed. Every scratch in the wood, every dark stain. It was as if it had walked across the yard during the night and decided to wait for me. My first instinct was to kick it off the porch and run back inside. But when I peeked through the window, it was still there, facing my house, like it was watching me. By late afternoon, Howard came home. I went to the fence like we always did, trying to act normal. He looked frail from his hospital stay, but when he saw me, his face darkened. "Son, what did you do?" The question was barely a whisper, laced with something that felt like fear. I told him everything. The shed, the chair, the faceless thing. Howard didn't speak for a long time. Then his eyes shifted to my porch. When he saw the chair, his expression twisted into something I can only describe as horror. "You brought him here." My mouth went dry. He picked up the chair and without a word carried it back to the shed. I don't know what he did after that, and I never asked. Since that day, I avoid that backyard like the plague. Howard stopped talking to me. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I hear a distant creaking sound, like wood rocking in the wind. But I never look out the window. Never again. This happened to me and my wife, Emily, 3 years ago when we moved to a small farm in rural Missouri. The idea was to live a quieter life, away from the chaos of the city, surrounded only by open fields and the silence of the night. I worked remotely as a programmer, and Emily took care of the house and the vegetable garden we had started. Our house was nearly a mile from the main road, with no neighbors nearby, just an old wooden fence separating our property from an endless field. At first, the isolation felt freeing, but over time I learned that solitude can be terrifying too. It all started so innocently that we barely paid attention. One chilly October morning, Emily found muddy footprints on the front porch. They were large, scattered, as if something had walked across during the night. We figured it was probably a deer, or maybe a stray dog from a nearby farm. I cleaned up the mess and went on with my day. But the next morning, they were there again, and the next. Each morning, the footprints seemed to creep a little closer to the front door. We thought an animal had taken shelter nearby, so we checked outside at night, but we never saw anything, just the wind rustling through the fields and the distant sound of crickets. By the second week, Emily started feeling uneasy. "Don't you think it's weird that they always end here but never start anywhere?" she asked, pointing at the tracks that stopped right at our doorstep. She was right. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of movement back toward the fields or the road. It was as if something just appeared on the porch and vanished. We tried everything to figure it out. We left food outside, thinking a stray dog might show up. Nothing. We put a bucket of water near the door, hoping to see if something would interact with it. Still nothing. Whatever was leaving those marks wasn't an ordinary animal. By the third week, we decided to install security cameras. I already had a few that I used to monitor the barn, so I positioned one facing the porch and another toward the open field in front of the house. I thought this would finally give us some answers. But instead, it only raised more questions. On the first night, we checked the footage and saw nothing, just an empty field, trees swaying in the wind. But the next night, we saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Standing in the middle of the field, yards away from the house, was a man. He wasn't moving. He was just there, motionless, staring at the house. The image was grainy, but I could tell he was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. The worst part was that, as we reviewed the footage, we realized he stood there for hours without taking a single step. No shifting, no visible movement. How could anyone stand still like that for so long? It was disturbing, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a lost hunter, or some local wandering through the area. Still, it was unsettling. The next morning, we went outside to check where he had been standing. But to our surprise, the grass was untouched. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that man standing there in the field, just watching. Emily was restless too. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to her nudging my arm. "Listen," she whispered. I held my breath, straining to hear. And then I caught it, a soft creak from the porch, like someone stepping carefully on the wooden planks. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and opened the security app. The feed loaded, and for a moment nothing seemed unusual. But then, on the edge of the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The front door was slightly open. Not completely, but just enough to send a wave of dread through me. "Did you lock it before bed?" I whispered to Emily, but I already knew the answer. We always locked it. We crept out of bed, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it could be heard through the walls. The hallway was dark, and the only sound was the wind howling outside. I grabbed a baseball bat that we kept leaning against the wall and inched toward the door, swallowing the lump in my throat. When I got close enough, I reached out and slowly pushed the door open. Nothing but the empty field beyond. I flipped on the porch light and scanned the area. No new footprints, no movement in the field. But then Emily gasped beside me and pointed at something near the doorway. There, on the wooden floorboards, was a set of fresh footprints. Wet. Not from mud, but something darker. Something that looked like blood. Panic gripped me. I crouched down to get a closer look, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe it was from an injured animal? But the shape of the footprints was unmistakable. They were human. And worse, barefoot. Emily clutched my arm tightly, her breathing unsteady. "We need to call the police," she whispered. I agreed without hesitation. I grabbed my phone and dialed, but as soon as I put it to my ear, the call dropped. No signal. I checked the screen, my stomach twisting when I saw the bars had completely vanished. It was as if something was interfering with the network. With no other choice, we decided that I would take the truck and drive into town for help. But when I opened the door to the truck, a chill ran down my spine. The hood was cold to the touch, but the windshield, it was covered in handprints. Long, thin streaks, as if someone had run their fingers across the glass over and over again. Emily saw them too, and let out a strangled gasp. I didn't think twice. I ran back inside, locked every door and window, and we barricaded ourselves in the bedroom. We didn't say a word. We just sat there, feeling the silence stretch around us, waiting for whatever it was to leave. When the sun came up, everything seemed normal. Except for one thing. We decided to check the security footage again, hoping that in the daylight, things would seem less terrifying. But when we played back the recording from the night before, we saw something we would never be able to explain. The man was there again, standing in the field, in the exact same spot. But this time, he moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head tilted, as if he was truly watching us. The footage showed that he stood there until just before dawn. But the most disturbing part was what happened at the end of the recording. At exactly 4:23 a.m., without warning, without any transition, he simply disappeared. One frame he was there. The next, he was gone. No movement, no shadow retreating. It was as if he had never been there at all. Emily slammed the laptop shut and looked at me, her face pale. "We need to leave." And I agreed. We packed the essentials and drove into town. We only returned with the police, who of course found nothing, no tracks, no new footprints, not even the handprints on the truck. But we had seen it. We knew what had happened. 2 days later, we returned to pack up our things and put the farm up for sale. Neither of us wanted to spend another night there. But before we left for good, I did one last thing. I borrowed a drone from a friend and decided to fly it over the property, just to make sure nothing strange was left behind. I sent it up high, capturing the entire field. At first, everything looked normal, just dirt and grass like always. But then when I zoomed in on the footage, I saw something that made my chest tighten. There, in the exact spot where the man always stood, was a hole. A deep, dark hole, large enough for someone to fit inside. As if he had been there, buried beneath us the entire time. I wanted to investigate, but Emily begged me to leave. I didn't argue. I just drove away without looking back. We sold the property soon after, never mentioning what had happened. I don't know who bought it, and I never wanted to find out. I just hope they never check the security cameras. To this day, I still wonder what that man was. If he was even a man at all. What did he want? Why did he stand there for so long without coming closer? And the strangest part, how did he just disappear? Emily doesn't like to talk about it, and I try to forget. But some nights, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel that same eerie sensation from back then. That primal instinct that someone is outside, watching me. I always turn toward the window, hoping to see nothing. But part of me is terrified that one day, I'll look, and he'll be there. I must have been around 9 years old when I spent the summer at my grandfather's farm. My parents had taken a long trip, some work-related travel for my dad, and decided it would be better to leave me with him rather than drag me around the world with them. I didn't mind. I loved that place. The house was old and creaky with the wind, but it had a warm scent of wood and coffee. The fields stretched as far as my eyes could see, and I spent my afternoons running through the tall grass, kicking rocks, and catching grasshoppers. The sun was hot, but the breeze made everything feel fresh, and at night, the stars looked so close I thought I could reach out and touch them. It was one of those summers that felt like it would never end. One of those afternoons was when I saw him for the first time. I was standing by the fence, kicking at the dry dirt, when my eyes caught something beyond the wheat field. In the middle of the golden stalks, there was a man. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't walking, wasn't waving. He was just there. From where I stood, I couldn't see his face properly, but he was tall, thin, and seemed to be wearing dark clothes. My eyes stayed fixed on him for a while, waiting for him to move. He didn't. That unsettled me, sent a shiver up my spine despite the heat. I ran back to the house and told my grandpa. I expected him to laugh or tell me it was just some farmer from the area, but that's not what happened. He stopped what he was doing, cleaning an old shotgun on the porch, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A serious look, almost worried. After a second, he went back to handling the gun and simply said, "Stay inside after dark." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up questions. My grandfather wasn't a man of many words, but that reaction unsettled me. He knew something and didn't want to tell me. That night I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. My room was on the second floor, and my window faced the fields. I remembered the man, and without thinking, I got up and looked. He was still there. Only now he was closer. Close enough that I could see his silhouette in the dim moonlight, still unmoving, still staring. My chest tightened, and I shut the curtain in a panic before crawling back into bed. But I didn't sleep for a long time. The next day, I tried to forget what I'd seen. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I spent the day exploring the barn, playing with my grandpa's dogs, and avoiding looking at the field. But as the afternoon faded into evening, that feeling returned. Like a weight pressing down on my chest, a nervous energy I couldn't explain. When the sun started setting, I found myself peeking through the kitchen window, looking out at the fields. My stomach twisted. He was still there, hadn't moved, hadn't left. It was like he was just waiting for me to notice him again. I waited until after dinner to ask my grandpa. I chose my words carefully, trying not to sound scared. "Grandpa? That man in the field? Does he live nearby?" He didn't even look up from his plate. He just took a bite of bread and said, his voice calm but firm, "He was there before I was born." The silence that followed made my skin crawl. My grandpa wasn't the type to joke. If he said that, he meant it. I swallowed hard and didn't ask anything else. The thought that this man, or whatever he was, had been standing there for so long, unmoving, watching, made my stomach turn. I tried to go to bed early that night, but my body felt like it was on high alert. I tossed and turned until at some point I decided I had to check. I had to know if he was still there. My room was dark, but the moonlight seeped in through the curtains. I got up slowly, ignoring the shiver running down my spine. With shaky hands, I pulled the curtain back just a little. My heart stopped. He was there. But now, he was much closer. Standing just outside the fence. Staring. My chest tightened. My eyes burned. I wanted to scream, but something inside me told me I shouldn't. I yanked the curtain shut and backed away, heart hammering in my chest. I stumbled over the rug and fell backward onto the floor. My first instinct was to run to my grandpa's room, but something stopped me. A deep, irrational fear telling me that if I moved, if I made a single noise, he might do something. I stayed there, lying on the floor, trying to slow my breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally crawled back onto my bed, pulling the blanket over my head like it could protect me. I didn't look out the window again that night. The next morning I walked downstairs feeling drained, like I hadn't slept at all. My grandpa was already on the porch, drinking his coffee like nothing had happened. But I knew that he knew. I hesitated before sitting next to him, silent. We just listened to the wind rustling the trees. Then, without looking at me, he asked, "Is he still there?" My throat tightened. My grandpa never asked things for no reason. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. He let out a slow sigh, tapped the bottom of his mug against the table, then finally said, "Best to leave him be." But how could I leave it alone? How could I ignore something that had been there every day, standing in the same spot just watching? Deep down, I wanted to believe it was my imagination. Maybe an old scarecrow, maybe just a strange shadow in the fields. But when night came, and I made the mistake of peeking through the curtains one last time, all my hopes disappeared. He was closer. Now, inside the fence. My breath caught, my hands shook. I wanted to run, to scream, but something inside me whispered that I shouldn't. I yanked the curtain shut and curled up in bed, trying to convince myself that if I ignored him, he wouldn't come any closer. That night was the worst of my life. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, filled with nightmares I couldn't separate from reality. More than once, I woke up thinking someone was in my room, but the darkness made it impossible to tell. When the sun finally rose, I ran outside, straight to the porch. The field was empty. No sign of the man, no footprints in the damp soil. I almost collapsed with relief. But my grandpa, seeing me there, just shook his head slowly, like he already knew. He always leaves before dawn. I never saw the man in the field again after that summer. But sometimes when I close my eyes before falling asleep, I still feel that presence. I still see that dark silhouette, standing in the tall grass, waiting. My grandpa passed away a few years later, taking whatever he knew with him. Maybe I should have pushed for answers, but part of me was too afraid to hear them. Now, as an adult, I think of it as one of those mysteries that never get solved. Only sometimes, late at night, when I look out my window, I swear I see something in the dark, watching me from afar.